Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Roundtable on Human Capital, Culture and Heritage, Unleashing the Potential. This is the third and last Roundtable that's taking place this week during the Public Policy Forum of the Africa Dialogue Series 2021. At the outset, I wish to welcome all our audience members who are joining and following our discussion through the Zoom platform or UN Web TV. Today's discussion will be focusing on maximizing the contribution of culture and heritage to human capital development and to the acceleration of progress towards the SDGs and the goals and targets of Agenda 2063. But it's also about changing narratives, about promoting a new narrative for Africa, a narrative that's shaped by Africans and driven by the ongoing socioeconomic transformation on the continent, as well as the efforts of African countries to unlock the potentials and the huge capacities of the continent, including its human capital, in particular through harnessing the demographic dividend and expanding opportunities for women's and youth participation. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts with wide-ranging expertise from arts, culture, and heritage to education and human development. Their insights, along with your questions during the interactive segment of this session, will provide new perspectives on maximizing the contribution of culture, heritage, and the arts to promoting economic growth that is socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. I'm pleased also to be joined by Mr. Brian Kofi, the moderator of our session. Mr. Kofi is a professional with degrees in diplomacy and public affairs from the School of Advanced International and Political Studies in Paris. After taking different experiences at the global level, Mr. Kofi had joined the World Heritage Center at UNESCO, focusing on the safeguarding and promotion of Africa's world heritage. Before handing over to Mr. Kofi, who will be guiding the rest of the session, I wish to advise our audience that interpretation is available through the Zoom platform in English, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. For a better experience, you are kindly advised to mute the original audio when selecting one of the interpretation languages. Should you have any problem in selecting the preferred language or muting the original audio, kindly ensure that you have the latest version of the app or that you are using a compatible platform browser. Lastly, I wish to encourage our audience to participate actively in the interactive segment of our session through the chat function on Zoom platform. The moderator will endeavor to ask as many of these questions to our panelists as possible during the Q&A part of the session. Without further ado, I hand over to Mr. Kofi. Mr. Kofi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. El-Shaar. Dear all, depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Allow me to welcome you to this sixth session of the Africa Dialogue Series, a roundtable on human capital, culture, and heritage, unleashing the potential. I am Brian Kofi, African World Heritage Specialist from UNESCO World Heritage Center, and it is my pleasure to moderate this session. I would like to remind participants that interpretation is available in several languages. Please select the appropriate channel to get a greater appreciation of the valuable contribution that our speakers will be making. The wealth of our nation is not in its produced capital or natural resources, but rather in its people. Once that is said, one can only accept that the people and their human capital represent a pivotal force for transformation and recognize the importance of investing in people. Africa has the largest share of young people in its population, and these young represent a demographic challenge for the continent. In addition to this, from the COVID-19 pandemic to socioeconomic problems, emergencies are multiplying on the continent and preventing culture, heritage, and human capital from being a force for development. Faced with such challenges, we need to take time to reflect on adequate strategies to better tackle these issues. The African Dialogue series, aligned with the theme chosen by the African Union for 2021 Arts, Culture, and Heritage, Levels of Building the Africa We Want, provide us with the ideal framework for this reflection. To discuss the key role of culture and heritage in unlocking human capital and in the development of Africa, I have the great honor to be surrounded by a panel of exceptional African professionals, all experts in African culture. One of them is the Professor Shadrach Shirukure. Professor Shirukure, he is a national of Zimbabwe with degrees in artifact studies and PhD in archaeology from the University College London. He is also a professor in the Department of Archaeology at University of Cape Town, where he directs 2 research facilities. Welcome, Professor. I would like to start. Thank you, Professor. I would like to start this conversation with you by talking about the mindset of African people regarding their culture. Africa is blessed with diverse and rich cultures and history and has an immense and promising human capital. Yet, the continent seems to be struggling to unlock its potential. Professor Shirukure, can you enlighten us on the realities and historicity of the obstacles to the unleashing of the continent's potential and tell us if education in a new form is the prerequisite to the achievement of our goal? The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much. Let's start with some numbers. Africa has the world's highest number of youths under the age of 25. It has the world's highest number of job seekers. 60% of the population of 1.3 billion was under the age of 25 in 2019. Brian, you said that was a challenge. I think this is an opportunity. According to the UNIRANK database in 2020, there were nearly 1,225 officially recognized higher education institutions in Africa. In the United States alone, there are 4,000 degree-granting academic institutions. The United Kingdom has 106 higher education institutions. So Africa, the African higher education system is lagging behind in terms of numbers. So Africa from Algeria to Zimbabwe has stunning heritage. You can talk of the pyramids in Egypt and Sudan, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, Great Zimbabwe, etc., etc. People in the past used to do things for themselves, using an education suited for satisfying everyday challenges, the education that combined doing, thinking, and knowing. So that is the root cause of the problem. Currently, because of colonial education and its legacies, people no longer are capable of doing things for themselves. Colonial education was about dependence. It was meant to create job seekers, not job creators. So, Brian, you were supposed to read, memorize, sit for an exam, pass, and look for a job, right? So in that employment, you would help with extracting resources, ship them to Europe, and then buy back finished products from Europe. So that's an education that emphasized knowing for the purposes of passing an exam, not for the purposes of creating jobs or to help people help themselves. In the United States, dropouts start successful companies like Apple and Microsoft. It's not graduates. Who are the most educated Africans with top companies in the world? So the question then is, could our ancestors have built Great Zimbabwe, the pyramids, or Lalibela if they believed in knowing without doing, like we do, and in knowing for the purpose of passing an exam and to get a certificate? That's where we need to change mindsets. That's where we need to change action. Culture and heritage is knowledge, is experience, is skill. It is not something to be gazed upon by tourists seeking awe-inspiring exotica. What ways of doing can we learn from culture and heritage to help us solve everyday problems? We need an education that is beyond colonial stereotypes. We need an education that emphasizing doing and knowing so that people can employ themselves. Nollywood in Nigeria is about doing. It is about thinking. It is about knowing. It is never about talking or just about taking exams. We need ways of certifying village knowledge, village science, and other knowledge that we bundle under the rubric of culture. An artisan who is not educated in the Western system can still use their hands. They can still solve their problems. We need to certify them. We need them to create jobs for others. There is also a Shona proverb which says that your ugly possession is better than a borrowed beautiful one. We cannot brag about having a degree from Harvard, from Cambridge, and cannot create a single job, and yet complain that, we have the highest number of youths and so on. We need to change mindsets. We need to come up with a new education that can help us. There is a role for everyone, for thinkers, for doers, for dreamers. And let us take possession of that which colonialism and neocolonialism continue to take from us, the ability to do and to think, create and do new things that will crystallize as African culture and heritage of present and the future. And that will, in my view, unleash human capital for Africa's development to meet the aspirations of Agenda 2063. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shirikure, for your contribution and reminding us the root cause and the importance of changing our mindset and going beyond colonial stereotypes and promoting our culture. I would like to focus our conversation for a moment on the promotion and safeguarding of our heritage. And to this, I have the pleasure of having with me Mr. Goma-Thethet. Native of Congo, Mr. Goma-Thethet is a specialist in the contemporary history of Africa and in the political history of Congo. Since 2019, he is vice president of the scientific committee for the inscription of the Congolese rumba to the intangible heritage of UNESCO. Welcome, Mr. Goma-Thethet.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Bonjour.
We are currently
Good morning.
We are currently working towards a possible inscription of the rumba on the list of intangible cultural heritage of UNESCO. As a cultural heritage common to both Congo, rumba has been subject of numerous meetings and research for several years. What have been the challenges of this initiative, and how does its success prove that transnational cooperation can be beneficial in achieving our goals? The floor is yours, Mr. Goma.
Merci bien, Monsieur Kofi. Bon, pour répondre à cette double question.
To respond to that dual question, firstly, I would like to recall that Congolese rumba is an intangible shared cultural heritage between the two Congos, even Angola, because of the belonging, the historical belonging and proximity which brings together the two peoples on both sides of the River Congo. More than anything else, it is in reality the music that has better sold the Congo in the world. It is not about oil or mineral resources, but it is mostly music that actually put Congo or DRC on the map. So what is the origin of this music that we want to put in the list of intangible cultural heritage in 2021? We need to look for origin of this music at the conference of different sources. This music is born in the 30s and 40s on the true banks of River Congo, which has the true closest capitals in the world, Leopoldville and Brazzaville. It was born from different currents and different influences. The first one, or the first trend, is a Cuban rumba. A Cuban rumba, which came in the 1930s, that came through music, and this is a music that was taken to the Americas by the slaves. When it comes back to its cradle land, it meets the local music, and it does a fusion with the local music in the Congo Basin. And to that, I need to add the traditional music of the Western African people, some that came through colonization. We also need to add the traditional music. So it is this melting pot that brought the explosion of Congolese rumba. And in the 1950s, from 1950s, we had the first big bands on both sides of the River Congo. We could give you four of them. What gave us the major Congolese rumba schools, African jazz of Joseph Kabasele. And Joseph Kabasele is the one who composed Independence Cha-Cha-Cha, the famous song, and which was an independence theme in African countries. We need to clarify that he's a saxophonist, and pianist was Manu Dibango. We also had TPOK Jazz, which was created by Brazzaville and Leopoldville at the time. We have Franco, Jean-Serge Jesus, Donga. Then we have Jean-Serge Jesus and his band, and these bands actually allowed rumba to be known in the 1960s in the African continent. And then in the course of time, rumba is going to have some kind of vitality by becoming at the same time an expression of social cohesion and also a driver of citizen movement for development. And it was also a call for African unity. Brazzaville and Kinshasa today are not only the melting point of rumba, but they are also the seats of two major festivals that bring together African youth. And we also need to add that Brazzaville and Kinshasa were named creative towns by UNESCO. So we see this trajectory that allowed rumba to be known throughout the world, and thanks to its diaspora, which has found out across the world, the President Sassou Nguesso and Felix Antoine Tshisekedi from DRC have applied for Congolese rumba to be put under UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage.
For showing us that intangible heritage spans beyond borders and can create social cohesion behind national borders. We will revert back to you during the question and answer answer, as this subject is a very important subject, and we will thoroughly talk about intangible heritage at that moment. So I would like to ask a question to our next panelist right now. As we have talked about intangible heritage, it's time also to speak about tangible heritage, especially as the condition and of safeguarding the two different heritage are very different. To talk about that, I would like to ask a question to Professor Uduku. Professor Ola Uduku is a British African architect who took up a chair in architecture at Manchester School of Architecture in 2017. Prior to this, she was reader in architecture and Dean International for Africa at Edinburgh University. Welcome, Professor Uduku.
Thank you.
To talk,
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, to talk about intangible heritage, and I want to say I have in mind the famous Ilojobar, a national monument in Nigeria built in the mid-19th century that has been demolished despite its rich history. I wanted to ask you, as you are also a member of the Nigerian Institute of Architects and specialist in the history of educational architecture in Africa, what are the key actions we can undertake to ensure that these edifices are also recognized and preserved?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this august panel. I should say that, yes, the tangible is somewhat different from the intangible heritage in Africa. Partly, I guess, culturally, we have to remember that a lot of African tangible heritage is much more temporal. So apart from some major and obviously significant heritage areas, such as indeed Great Zimbabwe, that has been talked about, the Benin walls, the walls of Kano, and obviously the pyramids in Giza, a lot of the heritage is much more temporal. So there's an idea around our understanding the fact that the built heritage has a longer life than traditionally would be the case. For most of us who have come from villages, you will know that houses that are made of wattle and daub and so on normally have a 3-year existence or thereabouts, 3 to 7 years, you take them down and you rebuild them. But certainly since the advent of colonization, and in the case of the coastal areas of Africa, the slave trade and so on, and missionary trading, we know that there have been these tangible forms of heritage, so buildings that last longer than, I guess, the normal dwelling house in vernacular architectural terms. So this means we have to have a better understanding of the importance of these buildings, but also tied up to this, obviously in the case of particularly West Africa, is this long history of other activities that have happened in these buildings, and the need to start to understand our historical education more. So back to what indeed my colleague Shadrach was saying, we need to understand our history to understand the significance of these buildings. So even if there's a painful past related to some of these buildings, it is still important for us to valorize these buildings and find a way in which these buildings speak to us about the past. And indeed, as a Nigerian saying, you cannot know your future unless you understand your past. So this involves a number of things. I think, first of all, we are in the South. We do not have the ability, as in the Louvre, say in Paris, or the British Museum in London, to say, okay, this building is now a museum. We have to make sure that these buildings have a resonance and a reality for people on a day-to-day basis. This is not about sending people to the museum of culture per se. It is engaging these buildings with the communities in which they sit. So in the case of Ilojobar, the problem was that indeed it was very much the property of a family, and the family had a family dispute. And therefore, in a way, its relationship to the community in which it sat was secondary to its relationship to the family that owned the land. There's that discussion around the family realizing that the building on which the Ilojoba exists, or the building itself, is as important as the land. So in many ways, there's that relationship between the families, the community there, and indeed, obviously, the government in saying, well, you may have a land dispute, but this building is very, very important. But then also the understanding amongst those in the community, particularly the youth, that these are buildings that are important, that we cannot keep importing our culture from the West. So the next skyscraper in Lagos might be, 40 stories high, but that is not, it might be part of an international culture, but we have a heritage that we really have to understand, if we do not maintain and look after, will disappear. And indeed, it will become intangible heritage if the tangible is not there. So there's that need, particularly for this education, which I think starts from primary school. I wouldn't even say it's at tertiary education level. We need to have these histories around our being able to look around us, literally in front of our noses, about what is ours and how these are important in the narrative and the stories of how we talk about our lives and livelihoods. I have to say that in the Ilojoba, and some of you will know this anyway, some of the stories that have come out do relate to the fact that it was a Brazilian returnee trader's house, and he did actually have slaves kept in that building for some time. So the history is bittersweet, but some of this history we do not even know. It is only now that the building has come down that a lot of the history that we should have known about this building is being told. The building should not have come down, there's no doubt about that. But there are ways in which we need to be able to educate the community from primary educational level right up to doing the research ourselves around the importance of these buildings. And then importantly as well, giving them a function in themselves. So I will give you an example here and then we can go on to the next person. Good example is the former prison on Broad Street in Lagos. This building, or rather the whole compound, was where the original colonial prison block was. The land is apparently owned by the federal government because it was owned by the colonial authorities. The plan was to have more high-rise buildings. Fortunately, the architect Theo Lawson was able to negotiate for the land to be turned into what is now called Freedom Park. In Freedom Park, architecturally, he has been able to show remains of the old prison blocks, and indeed histories of the last woman who was going to be hanged for murder, whose sentence was finally manumitted at the last minute. And this park now is both an area where people are able to listen to music, but they also, school children are able to go and find out about the history of the Broad Street prison. So this is a way in which what would have been commercial land for commercial property has now been reinvented as a park that people can visit. They can learn about their history, and they can also have it as a social space in what is one of the most crowded cities in sub-Saharan Africa, certainly Lagos. So it's a green space in itself. So these things are possible, but we have to really take the lead in making sure that we can keep an eye on these. And this happens through better education and better communication with the authorities in the case of land that is owned by the government, but also in terms of those who are landowners of historic sites. So they have more than just a function as being, this is a historic building. We don't have that option. We have to be able to give it a case in a purpose in itself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Uduku, for underlining the importance of a better understanding of our history, and also reminding us that we need to engage and re-engage in our history and in our heritage, and this at several levels of actors. It is difficult to talk about the safeguarding and protection of our culture without addressing the delicate but necessary subject that is the restitution of cultural property to Africa. To talk about it, I have with me Professor Amadi Bokoum. Professor Amadi Bokoum, is a native of Senegal and an archaeologist by training, author of several articles and scientific books. He has actively contributed to the preparation of several nomination files for inscription on the World Heritage List and is currently director of the Museum of Black Civilization in Senegal. Welcome, Professor. Professor, are you here?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you,
Thank you very much. I'm here. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear and see you.
You hear me?
I cannot hear you, says the professor. The professor says he cannot hear the moderator. I'm not able to follow the moderator. I'm sorry, I cannot follow you, says the speaker. Can you hear me? However, I hear you, Professor, very well. I'm not sure whether you can hear me. However, I cannot hear you, Mr. Moderator.
J'entends la traduction.
Okay.
I can hear the interpretation coming through.
Professor, Germany has recently pledged that by 2020 it will return bronzes from Benin looted during the colonial period. It has also been 3 years that the President Emmanuel Macron has pledged to return African cultural property looted during colonizations. Since then, the promise has been caught in an obstacle course. Beyond the complex implication that the work of restitution and cooperation imposes, on what principle, ethical or legal, should the return of these objects be based on? Have you heard my question, Professor?
Oui, tout à fait. J'ai tout à fait entendu votre.
Yes, I listened to your question. And one of the common denominators of your question is looting. Of course, that raises ethical issues that are significant. We know you've heard about the genocide and the Atlantic slave trade, and these are serious crimes against humanity. It's not just humans that are subject to these crimes, but also artifacts. You've cited Germany and France, which are two interesting cases. Germany, and then if you talk about Britain and Benin City, and today I believe these objects are meant to be repatriated, and that should be loaded, and this should be done by 2022 so that the artifacts are returned in good condition. But there are challenges. What they put in museums, once they were looted, they were in churches, in religious places. And when they come back, will communities just accept them, or will it be necessary to depollute them? Will we have to conduct rituals to accept these artifacts? A lot needs to be done so that communities who are going to receive these repatriated artifacts will be able to receive them with a peaceful mind. I think this is an important issue that I'm raising for Africa, Africa's future, as well as the future of humanity. Allow me to underscore the legal issues that should be addressed. It seems to me that they may seem to be simple issues, although jurisprudence may be complicated. So repatriating means that you're giving back the artifacts to their legitimate owners. And when you return the object, then it should not be complicated. but then sometimes things are done forcefully. We cannot insist that these objects are returned forcefully. We need jurisprudence. Germans seem to be very pragmatic about this issue when we talk about the return of Benin bronzes. They've also recognized the crimes committed in Namibia. There was genocide that was perpetrated there. But then that is not really sufficient to absolve what crimes were committed. So practically speaking, I think the Germans are very pragmatic. The French, with President Emmanuel Macron's declaration, have put in place the process when he made a pronouncement in Ouagadougou. We're talking about the Bible, the Quran. Things need to move. If progress is not made, what has been done by Benedict Savoy, Emmanuel Macron will not continue because it will be lost in the meanders of the French Parliament. Senegal was lucky to recuperate some objects, and in Benin there have been legal matters raised. We have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of objects that are found in various countries. I think the willingness or the commitment to change the status of these artifacts is what will make a difference. It's part of a revolution as we try to protect the heritage of our countries, but it has been difficult to legislate. So it cannot be ignored, and I think a lot needs to be done for us to move forward. It will move forward, and there are institutions that are in place. The United Nations system exists. Governments, states parties need to sit down at the table and discuss. When we talk about the World Cultural Governance via UNESCO, we could initiate some interventions so that we have applicable framework through which we can try to negotiate the repatriation of artifacts to the owners, the rightful owners. UNESCO had begun this, and Amadou Mahmoud had started this debate at the Intergovernmental Committee. He had initiated all this, and I think that is one of the ways to have a normative and regular framework that everyone would be able to access. Why am I saying this? I know that you gave me 5 minutes and I have 1 minute. So you're saying I have got 3 more minutes? Thank you, moderator. Kindly conclude, Mr. Bokoum. Yes, I will conclude. Germany will return to Nigeria what it wishes to return. Nigerians did not say we want this, that, or the other. That is the problem. And the other problem that seems to me to be the most significant for Africa's future, as you know, the sharing or the division of Africa was done in Berlin. We Berlinized Africa, if you wish. People decided what to take. If we go to the return of artifacts within the framework of Berlin, in 2021, we are going to have a cultural Berlin, I believe. We need to be very careful very prudent. We should not have cultural battles around the repatriation of artifacts. We have a continuum of culture permeating borders. We've talked about Rumba, that is in Congo, in Angola, and in Senegal, and that is the continuum of culture in Africa.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for enlightening us on the cultural and juridical difficulty of the restitution of goods, and also showing us that this is very much about bilateral relation and politics between countries. Now that we have assessed the importance of our culture and its safeguarding, it is necessary to discuss its place in our development policies. To begin with, I will give the floor to Mrs. Drani. Mrs. Drani holds a Master of Philosophy in Development Studies. She is also co-founder and former executive director of the Cross-Cultural Foundation of Uganda, an organization dedicated to promoting the value of culture in development approach. Welcome, Mrs. Drani.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question for you. You have previously called on our communities and government to start recognizing that our own culture has a role to play in facing the current challenges. In 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals provided a common global set of objectives based on foundation of human rights. What role does culture play in the achievement of these objectives?
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to contribute to this conversation. The Sustainable Development Goals are premised on human rights, which ultimately seek to enhance the quality of life of people now and in the future. Now, culture defines the context within which the SDGs are implemented and hopefully will be achieved. So culture influences how communities see the world and how these worldviews determine what is important or not important to them. So that will also determine how they relate to the SDGs. Culture also influences our values and principles, shared values across Africa. And they determine how we relate to people, but they also determine how we relate to nature. And culture also determines what we perceive as the good life. Ultimately, the SDGs, human rights are all contributing to what we might define as the good life. Culture has been defined in different ways, but if you look at culture as an entire way of life, then it cuts across all the SDGs. Given that I have very limited time, I'll just give a few examples. So if you look at SDG 1 and 2, which is about poverty and no poverty and zero hunger, what culture brings to the table is community resilience. So through cultural identity and social cohesion, culture brings social protection and social capital. So communities are together because of a common ancestry, because of a common identity, and in the absence of the safety nets that are provided by development partners, culture provides that security for communities. So through extended families, clans, kinship systems, when in crisis of hunger and poverty, culture is a fallback for our communities. Traditional occupations and skills such as farming, fishing, pastoralism, and others all contribute to decent work and employment. And if only these could be built upon in terms of industries that build upon the knowledge and skills of communities to fight poverty and hunger, rather than importing different occupations to be built on what they know and they love. Culture is a source of alternative, grounded bodies of knowledge. So for instance, you look at health, which is goal 3. Across Africa, there are traditional healing practices, whether it's traditional birth attendants, bone setters, herbalists, there's traditional medicine, there's preservation of sacred forests where there are medicinal plants. According to UNESCO, 80% of Africans use traditional medicine. So that is a contribution that culture is making to health and well-being. Of course, now because of COVID, we might be overwhelmed, but in the background, that is what is happening. Culture contributes to cognitive ability, especially through non-formal education. Our first stage of learning is non-formal, and it is through culture. And later on in life, there's apprenticeship, there's initiation, traditional practices, and all these are spaces where knowledge and skills are passed down, which complement, of course, what we learn in formal education for those who are privileged to have formal education. Gender is another controversial issue, gender equality, but gender is a social construct and it is influenced by culture. Culture is at the center of identity and power relations. So culture defines the roles and responsibilities of men, women, and children in society. So culture also determines the narrative of equality and whether this is accepted or rejected. So you cannot speak about gender equality without engaging culture and understanding what rights culture provides for women, men, and children. If you think about peace and justice, which is goal number 16, peaceful coexistence is a cultural value across most African communities because we're so diverse. And therefore, there's a provision for traditional governance systems. There's an emphasis on compensation and reconciliation. And sometimes these systems work together with government, and sometimes they're parallel. But they exist and they do contribute, especially to those who are not able to access information. So the question is, how much do we as Africa and Africans invest in understanding, utilizing, and strengthening the resourcefulness of culture to identify sustainable development solutions? The challenge, of course, is to interrogate each goal and see where culture plays a role which could enhance or hinder the achievements of these goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Jani, for showing us and explaining us how culture is very much involved in all the sustainable goals. In order to achieve this objective, this goal, it is also necessary to undertake some overall structural transformation. To evoke this, I would like to give the floor to Professor Charles Binam Bikoi, a native of Cameroon. Professor Bikoi is a research director and university professor specialized in ancient civilization and oral tradition. Since 2006, he is executive secretary of Tokozile, an international institution in charge of the preservation, promotion, and valorization of African traditions and languages. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are you seeing me, or I don't? I can see you, but I'm not.
I cannot see you right now, but I can hear you perfectly, sir.
Okay, let me try. I hope my video is. There's a problem with my video.
Okay, I think
we'll hear me.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, and we will go with the sound, sir. I have a question for you.
Yes.
There is a new concept that have recently emerged from Tokozile, which is induced tradition. I would like to hear you elaborate on this concept and explain to us how the exploitation of these induced traditional resources can contribute to culturally sustainable development and participate in the liberation of the continent's potential.
Oui, merci beaucoup de cette question. Comme vous venez de le dire,
thank you, Mr. Moderator, for this question. I worked with a number of colleagues and have been able to put on the market this new concept known as indust tradition. It is not just a theoretical and operational concept, but it's also a paradigmatic one. It is a part of the process to deconstruct the development paradigm of Africa as has been presented thus far. Post-independence, a number of countries, African countries, relooked or rethought their policies. However, all their recommendations did not result in much. They were in vain. It did not enable us to have a real African development theory, and we thought that the time was ripe to move to another stage, a stage that will ensure that Africans take ownership of their development, look at their developments as well as the diversity of opportunities available to them. It should not be a part of well, it should be. We should not just be a reservoir of resources, be they human or natural resources for others. And here I'm talking about raw materials for development. So it's a process towards culture. Culture is not just the recounting of stories or legends. It's part of the life of humans. You cannot imagine that Africans are just men, and the African continent is where these Africans live. You have development plans, you have policies from other continents, but for us, the solution, it would be taking ownership of authentic knowledge in a scientific and systematic way, understanding environment and traditions, and through those traditions, they can create new models to think, to act, to prosper, to cooperate, to trade, and to do things. And here, when I talk about trade, I'm talking about the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. So, this is what an industrial tradition means. It's a concept that will reverse the current trend that is harmful to Africa. So Africa needs to lay the common foundations for its future. Industrial tradition is a concept that puts African values at the center and at the center of production systems. It's an operational concept that enables us to identify our brands globally. When you talk about the production for development and economic growth, and the cultural dimension is focused on creativity, invention or innovation, fashion, food, architecture, arts, environmental management. Also will be taken into account from daily practice by African community. We are thinking practically. You can imagine that each African village or community is a significant production that enables us to rethink development. So industrial tradition is the scientific, rational use of traditions for Africa's industrialization. Thank you.
For showing us and reminding us the importance of using our tradition and our culture scientifically in a scientific way for the development of our continent. I would like to talk now about another important aspect of our continent's tradition, which is the linguistic diversity of Africa. And this is question that, as I look at the chat right now, is currently being debated and asked by our attendees. And to do so, I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Erina Dia. The Dr. Dia, before moving to UNICEF's headquarters as principal advisor on early childhood development, worked as a chief of education in West and Central Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. She has co-authored several papers and journal articles on education channels and opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Dr. Dia. Dr. Dia, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. I have with me a quote from a linguist and professor, Stephen L. Walter. He said, "The evidence is strong that multilingual education programs where children's first language is used sharply accelerate the acquisition of reading skills, though this advantage appears to be significantly reduced in early exit programs where instruction shifts to second language." With this quote, we understand that language of instruction, along with other features, of course, is an important factor in a quality education. How can we ensure that education stakeholders and institutional partners are acting collaboratively, to address the issue of language of instruction? And acknowledging that 2019 was proclaimed International Year of Indigenous Languages, how can international organizations work towards the preservation of local languages as a cultural heritage and key role in unleashing the human capital?
Thank you, Mr. Kofi. It's an honor to be here with you today. Yes, education from early childhood to university, and one of my colleagues have said that before, certainly has a role to play towards preserving local languages and cultural heritage. But because of its particular importance in the life of the child, allow me to focus on early childhood. The beginning of preschool through the end of the first grade, roughly ages 3 to 7, is a critical time for young children to begin developing content knowledge, language, literacy, social and emotional skills, learning skills, competencies that not only enhance children's learning experiences in the early years of schooling, but also provide the foundation for more advanced learning as they progress through the grades. And because they also provide an opportunity for teachers and caregivers to nurture a young child's natural curiosity and eagerness to learn, it is imperative for educators to cultivate supportive classroom relationships and promote children's positive identity formation, recognizing that each one of them brings to the classroom a diverse set of assets that must be recognized and leveraged for school learning. And for the children themselves, these early grades represent a time of adapting to new cultural, academic, linguistic demands, as they're expected to learn the school-related content knowledge, in many cases in a language relatively new or completely foreign to them, English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, depending on the colonial history of the country. And they have to do so in a way that differs from those in their homes, communities, and cultures, in an environment which neglects and even represses their cultural identity. And this is done in spite of the fact that there's a lot of scientific evidence telling us that learning first in one's mother tongue leads to better outcomes in the future for the individual themselves, but also cultures and nations. And if embedded in the local culture and delivered in the mother tongue, learning can have a strong impact on the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, on a person's cultural identity and self-esteem, and therefore on her or his future participation in national development. Unfortunately, and I said that before, many children are forced to learn in a language they poorly understand, and adding to this in an environment which neglects and even represses their cultural identity, and the language that carries it, usually because governments tend to spend very few resources on early childhood care and education to start with. Secondly, and as importantly, because there's little effort into creating a developmentally and linguistically appropriate curriculum and pedagogy for young children. And this carries on all the way toward their education. Another colleague has mentioned that before. International organizations like UNICEF have a key role to play, therefore, preserving local languages as a cultural heritage. And this can be done working in collaboration with governments, civil society, the private sector, in order to ensure children's right to education in a culturally relevant context, with actions that can be taken at both upstream and downstream levels. At the national level, support towards the development of national policies and strategies for the promotion of mother tongue in early childhood care and education. It is said a lot, it's mentioned a lot, but still we are missing that on our continent. This will be required, definitely. Of course, implementation will involve capacity building in the area of public finance for children, notably how do we convince governments to put more money in that area, as well as high-level advocacy and identification of champions and models to be replicated. Collection of more rigorous evidence on effectiveness of existing programs will be a must for replication and scale-up. At the downstream level, we can have interventions to advocacy within local communities on the need for both early childhood care, missing in a lot of remote areas, and encouragement of families and communities to support intergenerational transmission of mother tongue through sustained interaction with children in these languages. These efforts must translate into the establishment of accessible and affordable programs using mother tongue as the language of community. That will involve identification and support to members of indigenous and ethnic minority groups for training and certification as preschool and early grade facilitators and teachers. Of course, there will be practical challenges, key among them the general feeling or belief that mastery of the national language is more important than maintenance of one's own language. While it will take time, this can be addressed through advocacy and communication for development. There will also be the need to produce mother tongue materials and train teachers to use this. It involves a cost, certainly, but a cost that can be later recovered from greater efficiency in the education system, society, and the economy at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Dia, for your contribution and for underlining the importance of local language in early childhood, as well as showing us at different levels how its use and preservation can be carried out. I would like to talk a bit more about the role and efforts of the international community, in our strategies. And to do so, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Steinlake Samkanje. Mr. Samkanje is a national of Zimbabwe who serves as the Senior Director for Strategic Partnership Division of the United Nations World Food Programme, a position he assumed in 2018. With a successful career in this organization, Mr. Samkanje has also served in the office of the Secretary General as a speechwriter and as a political officer in the Department of Political Affairs. Welcome, Mr. Samkanje.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Thank you, sir. I have a question for you, which is very simple. How can the international community, and especially the United Nations system, enhance its support for African efforts to unleash the potential of human capital through leveraging its culture?
Thank you for that question. And as you say, in a way, it's a simple question, but simple questions mean often there are many, many answers. One of the answers, in fact, of how the UN can contribute to this subject is exactly through the agency of UNESCO. There's a whole United Nations agency that is focused on these questions and on helping to advance culture in Africa and elsewhere. So that's one answer, but that's too easy. So what I would like to focus on really are three ways in which the UN system can help address this issue. First is focusing on supporting countries, helping them to prioritize human capital investments. Second would be related to facilitating and enabling South-South cooperation. And the third way would be to support diversity and cultural differences and different cultural perspectives within the UN system itself and within the broader international community. So these are the three ways that I'd like to briefly focus on. First, in terms of investing in human capital, culture is, of course, as has already been said, It's about people and what people create. If you have no people, there's no culture. So investing in those people is really critical. That means investing in education, whatever type of education, but focused on investing in education and on schools. This is critical for our countries to invest in and to prioritize, as also been mentioned by some of my colleagues. Second, I would just highlight the importance of investing in the learner. So yes, you need to invest in schools and education, but you also need to invest in the people that are in schools and being educated so that they are able-bodied and able-minded to be able to take forward the issues that we're talking about. And third is to also in the 21st century to be able to invest in skills that enable people to compete and perform in the 21st century. And overwhelming that also means digital. So unless we're investing in ensuring that children and people in Africa have digital skills and are able to perform in a digital world, we're not going to be able to get the results that we hope for. Second, the issue of South-South cooperation. I think this is really very important. It's very important in practical ways, but it's also very important in symbolic ways. It's very important as a message in that it underlines that countries of the South, countries in Africa, have important experiences and lessons to share with each other. Yes, it's important to also to benefit from experiences and knowledge globally, wherever that knowledge is, but there's a special importance also exchanging knowledge and experiences among countries in similar situations. And so South-South cooperation and that process is really critical for helping countries to deal with cultural challenges that in many cases are similar across the region, both in terms of solutions, but also in terms of how you evolve culture in ways that are progressive and important and in line with the goals, broader goals of the UN system. Already the issue of gender equality has been mentioned. Countries have addressed this in different ways, understanding the experiences that countries and cultures in Africa, and societies in Africa have used to move forward on a global agenda. It's really a critical importance in promoting cultural heritage and exchange in Africa. It's often the key to the solutions of practical problems is this kind of similar cultural exchange. And then lastly, the issue of diversity within the UN system. You know, we have to practice what we preach. We have to demonstrate also and show the value that we give to diversity and to cultural diversity, including especially to African culture within the UN system and within the UN family. That can be done in a variety of ways. We don't have time to go into today, but that cultural diversity and showing that is valued in international dialogue, in the international community, that's a critical message and thing that the UN system can bring. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Samkanje. Thank you for showing us 3 concrete ways in which international community, and especially the United Nations, can support the unleashing of the potential. I would like to give the floor now to the Dr. Ishanlosen Aodia. Sorry, my video was blocked. I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Aodia. Do you hear me?
I can hear you, Brian. Do you hear me?
Yes, I have it. Okay, yes, I can hear you now. Sorry for this problem. Dr. Aodia is a national of Nigeria and senior social development specialist in the social sustainability and inclusion global practice of the World Bank. Prior to that, she was a consultant to various international organizations, including UNESCO and the African Development Bank. Welcome, Dr. Aodia.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to have you, Doctor. On February 2020, the African Union adopted its own digital transformation strategies with the objective of harnessing digital technologies and innovation to transform African societies and economies. My question for you will be, how can African member states leverage the digital transformation strategy to further develop the opportunities provided by Africa's culture and heritage for sustainable development, as well as key soft power tools promoting social and cultural values for the continent?
Thank you very much, Brian. So let's just start very quickly by looking at the promise that digital technologies hold for us. Because first of all, we must recognize that it has promise for sustainable development, and considerable effort and creativity is required for us to bridge, to use the digital technologies to bridge the existing inequalities, to give voice to the most vulnerable. And some of these people are the custodians of the heritage and traditions that we are so passionate about conserving. And they also offer the promise to strengthen the ability of communities and groups to cope with shocks such as climate change, pandemics, and interpersonal violence and conflict. Achieving the good country-led outcomes in digital transformation to accompany the commitment of African state parties will require an ecosystem approach that goes beyond incremental success to ensuring the impact on skill and dealing with the risks of exclusion, which I'll come to down the line. It is important for us to invest in human capital on the continent because the application of digital content will require us ensuring that this content is relevant to the people that it is targeted to serve on the continent, and also to prepare the youth to match the skills that are demanded by the evolving labor market of our times. Digital technology is important for documenting and preserving cultural heritage. We have, and it helps us to give a snapshot in time and to conserve endangered heritage. It is a powerful tool to reach wider audiences, to share stories of contemporary Africa, and to disrupt the prevailing narratives, which has already been alluded to. And it is also a good tool for African youth to share hope and spread messages of peace where there's conflict and fragility. The African Digital Transformation Strategy recognizes that education will be the bedrock for the innovation and creativity that is required to achieve its aims. And so through its flagship Digital Economy for Africa, or the DE4A initiative, the World Bank supports the African Union's strategy. I'll give some examples of various ways in different sectors that the bank is supporting this. For instance, if I take the World Bank's Higher Education Centers of Excellence project, which since 2014 has supported the development of at least 75 centers, African Centers of Excellence, or ACE, in 50 universities in 20 countries. These have been developed to focus on regional priorities in sectors such as health and agriculture. They focus on research into diseases, human and animal diseases that are unique to the continent, building on cultural knowledge and understanding of biodiversity to develop herbal medicine, plant breeding to improve the production of staple foods and meet the goal of the SDGs regarding hunger. In doing this, digital technologies have been critical for advancing these traditional knowledge systems in the various sectors already mentioned. And several of these centers are making remarkable progress in meeting their set objectives. For instance, the traditional use of shea butter in West Africa, which a lot of us from that part of the continent know, has been advanced by a female researcher in Burkina Faso, who has developed a cream from honey and shea butter for the treatment of burns. And this has been patented. Now, moving from the development of something like this cream that I have just given an example for, we now need to move on to commercializing all this knowledge that is coming out of these research centers. And we'll need to do this in an inclusive manner. beginning with the communities that contributed the foundational knowledge upon which such research findings and outcomes are premised. We need to ensure that inclusion helps them to profit from any commercialization, that commercialization and the benefits of commercialization reach the most vulnerable Africans. This will require strong support, first from the public and private sectors in the countries in which these research centers are located, and then from the international community at large. Secondly, the World Bank's art program supports the creative sector in Africa. Through its year-long We Are Africa exhibition from June 2020 to May 2021, it will be ending at the end of this month, it has created a platform to promote dialogue within and outside of Africa around various themes ranging from human capital to rural experiences, social norms, breaking stereotypes, and the digital future for the creative industries. The exhibition has created the space during this pandemic to highlight some of the innovations taking place in the creative sector. The use of digital platforms to sell goods and tourism services to local markets when the international tourism traffic was hit by the global shutdown. The creation and sharing of videos to create content and tell local stories to a global audience, providing a unique tourism experience of the beaten track. We will all remember last year how the Jerusalem dance from Africa became a global hit. And how did this happen? The use of digital technologies. Thirdly, sharing knowledge about African culture has been enhanced through the digital environment. And we see examples such as those of the Ifa divination from Nigeria in mobile apps. However, the full extent of digital technologies remain to be fully harnessed in the cultural sector in Africa. For instance, we need to look more into how we can use virtual reality for artistic purposes, the programming of intellectual property rights for cultural heritage, and the production of new forms of art. We do have to recognize that while digital technologies can be disruptive, they also provide opportunities for vulnerable and marginalized groups through the establishment of platforms for dialogue and social cohesion, and can be a force for economic, social, and cultural development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Odiawa, thank you for reminding us the benefits that can be derived from digital and for giving us those concrete examples. I will quickly give the floor to our last panelist, Ms. Thokozile Ruzvidzo, Director of the Gender, Poverty and Social Policy Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Ms. Ruzvidzo has, over the last 40 years, held leadership positions in various institutions. As a social development and gender expert, she has country, regional, continental, and international experience and works extensively on human and women's rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment. Welcome, Ms. Ruzvidzo.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Thank you. I thought I was muted. Thank you.
No, I can hear you perfectly, Ms.
Thank you.
The world is currently grappling with recovery from the worst health and economic crisis for nearly a century. According to new data released by UN Women and United Nations Development Programme, the COVID-19 crisis will dramatically increase the poverty rate for women and widen the gap between men and women who live in poverty. COVID-19 is therefore a grave setback for inclusive socio-economic development in Africa. However, the recently implemented African Continental Free Trade Area is supposed to offer state parties an opportunity to have an holistic approach to industrial policies and address gender barriers and promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development. My question for you, Ms. Ruzvidzo, will be, how can we ensure that the market liberalization, which will certainly open up important trade and economic opportunities, will not have a differential impact on women and men, knowing that gender inequalities in access to resources and opportunities exist?
Thank you, Brian, for that question. Let me start by highlighting that the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA, is a market of 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of 3.2 trillion. So we are speaking big. It creates economies of scale for small economies within the continent and increases trade among African member states. And currently, the total trade stands at 14%, relatively small, and there are opportunities within the AFCFTA. Women play a significant role in trade in Africa and will be essential to the continent's success in leveraging the full potential of the AFCFTA. There are large numbers of women entrepreneurs in Africa, but women continue to face challenges and obstacles that limit their competitiveness and make their businesses less productive than those owned by men. And we all know this. Women also comprise the vast majority of the informal cross-border traders. Let's look at all the cross-border trading in West Africa. The majority are women. And these female traders are disproportionately affected by non-tariff barriers, including corruption, harassment, misinformation about customs procedures and regulations, and sometimes confiscation of their goods, and we are all familiar with this. The AFCFTA agreement explicitly recognizes the importance of gender equality. Article 3E specifies that the AFCFTA aims to promote and attain sustainable, inclusive socio-economic development, gender equality, and structural transformation. And this is so key, especially if member states recognize that and implement. Likewise, Article 27D of the AFCFTA Protocol on Trade in Services makes explicit reference to improving the export capacity of formal and informal service suppliers, with particular attention to micro, small, and medium-sized operators and women and youth service suppliers. This is key that they look at micro, small, and medium, and that's where the majority of women entrepreneurs are. Let us all remember that women are not a homogeneous group. The AFCFTA implementation will affect them differently, depending on characteristics like their education, experience, location, and their role in the economy. Therefore, understanding the gendered impact of intra-African trade liberalization is therefore critical to ensure equality of opportunity for women and men under the AFCFTA. The AFCFTA's impact on African agriculture trade is particularly relevant for women. Agriculture is the backbone of the African economy, and women represent about half the labor force in this sector. The AFCFTA can promote women's economic empowerment by providing them with expanded access to regional food markets and stimulating demand for intra-African food imports. Smallholder female farmers in particular could benefit from opportunities to integrate their activities into regional agricultural value chains and higher value-added agro-processing activities. At the same time, however, female farmers in some African countries may be adversely affected by increased food imports from other AFCFTA member states, and this could be a challenge. But if the whole AFCFTA is implemented with a gender eye, this will not be a challenge. The AFCFTA's impact on Africa's industrial and service sectors is also relevant to gender equality. Export-oriented industrialization can have significant gender-specific effects. For example, the creation of export processing zones in some African countries has brought women new opportunities in manufacturing, but kept the majority confined to low-paid and unskilled jobs. Similarly, Africa's expanding service sector has brought formal skill-intensive jobs for some highly educated women, but the majority of the women in this sector have remained trapped in poorly paid occupations, including street walking. And we are all familiar with this when we walk the streets of our countries. Across all sectors, the FCFTA will expand opportunities for intra-African trade. In doing so, it can promote entrepreneurship and economic opportunities for women-owned SMEs and micro-enterprises, both in the formal and informal sector, because we also have to recognize that in the formal sector, we have some successful women-led businesses. African countries can also help to ensure that women benefit from the opportunities created by the AFCFTA by adapting gender-sensitive approach to implementing the AFCFTA provisions that directly affect women. The introduction of a continent-wide simplified trade regime that is sensitive to the needs of small-scale female traders can help bring such traders into the formal trading system and support their participation in new trade and businesses opportunities that the AFCFTA will provide. And it's important that this is brought to the attention of women in the informal sector and small businesses. Likewise, targeted policy interventions that address gender-specific impediments could further improve the productivity and competitiveness of female-owned enterprises, allowing them to grow and to exploit opportunities created by the AFCFTA. And as we speak, the informal traders, the female informal traders across the continent have come up and formed associations to start engaging with the AFCFTA and ensure that they benefit when the AFCFTA is fully implemented. So the opportunities are there. The the women in business and the female informal traders are willing to engage. Finally, the COVID pandemic has exposed vulnerabilities, but has also created opportunities within the AFCFTA. And the previous speaker did speak to this, the digital uptake and its potential for improved access by women. For example, in just a few months, COVID-19 accelerated digitalization rapidly. In Africa, 61% of a sample of firms that we surveyed at UNECA reported an increase in online sales since the start of COVID-19. While in another survey that we undertook, 75% of businesses in this goods sector and 61% of micro-sized enterprises with high representation by women entrepreneurs, which was very interesting and fascinating for us, shows that even women businesses are engaging. Therefore, digital deliverable services from Africa, which though currently limited, have grown to 2.5-fold since 2005. Whilst digital technology solutions in agriculture have been found to increase yields by 20%. If emerging digitalization can be scaled, it could be transformational, helping especially women entrepreneurs and businesses to sustainably industrialize and diversify within a global digital economy, estimated to be more than 11.5 trillion in 2019, and obviously facilitating online engagement and sales, especially for women entrepreneurs. So certainly the FCFTA can open up important trade and economic opportunities for women if implemented with a gender perception, as well as an increasing understanding of where women entrepreneurs and women in business are, and that they are able to take advantage of the opportunities that are in the AFCFTA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ruzvidzo. Thank you for reminding us that women and gender are not forgotten in the implementation of the AFCFTA and the importance of implementing this one with bearing in mind the gender gap and the place of women. Thank you, everyone, all our panelists, for your contribution and for thoroughly answering my questions. Without further ado, we shall proceed to a question and answer session where the audience will be able to interact and ask a question via the chat. I will afterward resume the question and ask them directly to your panelists. Please feel free to speak freely, but keep in mind the fact that we have an allocated time. While I was listening to you, I have been noticed that there were several subjects in the chat that was brought up. The issue of heritage preservation, the issue of African representation as well, and languages. So I will start by asking a small question about heritage preservation. And the case that was brought up in the chat by Judge Ralph Bello Fadile was about Kunta Kinte Island, which have been suffering from several climate changes, also climate changes impact. So this will also open and tackle another subject, which is climate change, that we have not yet talked. He asked the panelists, what can we do to preserve this heritage, which is also inscribed in the World Heritage List of Gambia?
I'm happy to go first to begin with, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Professor Duko.
There's already what's called the Roots to Roots Coastal Heritage Project, which is being both, as I understand, funded by UNESCO and has a lot of support from America because of the relationship, obviously, to the transatlantic slave trade. What is important about this, and this comes back to what has just been said about the fact that actually a lot of African countries, linguistically, we are quite similar. The issue is more the fact that at colonization and the Berlin Conference, countries were more chopped up and so on.
Je vous signale que le son est très mauvais en tout cas. À Dakar, nous avons un très mauvais son.
So in the case of the coastal, what I would call the coastal heritage of West Africa, really from around Gabon all the way to Senegal, we have a similar coastal history, which is both painful but also culturally interesting in the sense that we've been involved in actually trading activities before the slave trade, during the slave trade, and even afterwards. Now with the Roots to Roots Heritage Trail, there is that maintenance of these links from the castles and forts in Ghana and Senegal to the coastal areas like Badagry in Lagos. But they're also part of this climate change, what could I call it, Anthropocene as well. The coast of Africa is also subject to climate change. So there's a way in which both heritage and the need to look at climate preservation are working hand in hand. Now, as you know, part of the issue about climate change is bigger than, it's a global issue. But what we can do by being able to realize how important this heritage is to start working regionally, if not transcontinentally, to really reduce the amount of overfishing and the issues that affect the encroachment of the coast around West Africa. I have certainly been to Ghana obviously before the COVID crisis, and it has been said that the coastline around from Cape Coast onwards has receded by more than 10 meters in the last 5 years. So it's a real thing. And the way we look at it is to look at both heritage, climate change, and look at, I would say, international ways of making sure that we're able to both look at heritage, but also see its effect or see the effect of climate change on reducing this heritage. So we need to invest in this and look at both technological ways, but really more importantly, just educating again the local and internationals, because there's a lot of overfishing and so on in these same coastal regions, which all contribute to the effect of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Uduko. Is there any other panelists who want to tackle also this question? I will, on a personal note, talk about the climate change aspect.
Écoutez, nous, on n'entend pas grand-chose à Dakar, hein? On n'entend pas grand-chose. Donc, je ne sais même pas quelle est la question posée. On n'entend pas.
Okay, do the other panelists hear me well? Is it only Mr. Bokum?
We can hear you, Brian.
Okay. Mr. Bokum, you might have a problem with your microphone. Though we hear you well.
Non, mon micro, il est ouvert. Bon, je vous entends un peu mieux. Bon, donc, j'espère que ça va aller.
Do you hear the translator? Are you on the good channel?
Très bien, j'entends très bien la traduction.
Okay, perfect then. What I wanted to
Le
say...
micro est peut-être fâché contre M. Kofi là.
What I wanted to say about the climate change aspect of this question, and as you said, because the question was also to talk about the Kunta Kinte island and related sites, which is a site inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2003. The World Heritage Center is also very concerned by the question of climate change impacts on cultural heritage. So it has been recently working on a capacity building risk management project, which goal is to build the capacities of site managers and local communities in the management and evaluation of different risk to cultural heritage, associated with disaster risk. So this is an important question. Thank you for bringing up the subject of climate change, and the World Heritage Center as well is thinking about this and trying to find solutions. I have another question coming from the chat, which is about, there were actually many conversations and many messages about the representation of Africa, in various international cultural conventions and other instruments. Despite numerous efforts and initiatives to reserve this trend, because all reports point out that Africa is often underrepresented, concrete results are still hard to come. What do you panelists think are the limits of this international instrument, and why does Africa, despite its efforts, still struggle to rectify this? Is there any one of you who want to answer this question? Dr. Ojawa, are you here? I know you have experience when it comes to World Heritage sites. Can you say a few words on this?
Thank you. Actually, I was trying to get my head around the question, but if I understood correctly, it's about representation on the World Heritage List and why Africa is underrepresented. I think there are various factors to it because, and here I'm speaking from my previous life and as somebody who has worked in the World Heritage space. We have a convention that several countries have adhered to, but at the same time, there is a perception following what has happened since the very first sites were inscribed in 1978. There is a perception that World Heritage inscription could be more, prohibitive than an opportunity. Why do I say this? Because countries have seen situations where committee decisions have seemed to be against development. In a world where we're talking today about things like climate change, and we also see this in the climate change space, where countries from the global south are saying we are not responsible for the climate change that we're experiencing today, because at the end of the day, the countries in the global south are the least emitters, but they are the ones that are being asked to make the most sacrifices regarding their own development needs.
Et puis, je pense que ce n'est pas la peine de signaler le nom du médiateur. Il faut juste que les médiateurs qui a fait la visite là, ce n'est pas la peine de les citer, parce qu'on sera obligé de les citer tout le temps après. Juste les médiateurs. Non, ce n'est pas la peine. Oui, oui.
Okay. So, I think one of the things that we have done in the Africa region, that has happened with the states parties, has been to address this issue related to how do African states parties themselves benefit from the latent opportunities in these heritage sites, and while keeping to their obligations and international commitments regarding sustainable development, and climate change. And so we came, I mean in 2016, we had the states parties came up with the Ngorongoro Declaration on leveraging African World Heritage for sustainable development, which is to say, let us partner on this question regarding how do African countries develop, harnessing the potentials that they have in both their cultural and natural heritage and moving it forward to meet the development needs. The crying needs for access to markets, the crying needs for roads, for medical facilities. How do we harness the potentials in heritage and meet that need in a manner that still respects our international obligations to these conventions and to these global compacts? And these are the questions that I think we do need to provide support at various levels. And I think all the experts that are here today to support the states parties in this. Because once we also address, that's one thing about the development. The second thing is the whole question about colonization. Who determines the outstanding universal values that make a site a World Heritage Site? And I think Professor Chirikure also alluded to this earlier on, the same thing as Professor Uduku. And whose values are we talking to when we're talking about outstanding universal values? And what is the yardstick? When a nomination dossier is submitted, what is the yardstick for the measurement? And so having more and more African experts and specialists in the heritage field get more involved in these international processes and have, like Ms. Drani said earlier, the worldview is important. Have your worldview reflected in that global compact. That helps to take forward the issues regarding the measuring stick and the representation at the international level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Udiawa. Is there any other panelists who would like to intervene on this?
I think I will come in here as well and say there is actually a paucity in the way in which our educational structures work at the moment. So at this point, I am talking about higher education. Certainly in, again, West Africa that has had universities since the 1960s. And to be honest, archaeology, anthropology, architecture have all been taught since the 1960s. We really have not, I think, been able to leverage as much as we should have in terms of our being involved in these organizations. Some of it is the colonization of education, but I would say certainly West African history is very well taught. So we don't really have that as an excuse. Some of it is the fact that we do need to be at the table to change the narrative. The narrative at international organizations is normally framed by the North, unless as the South, we actually make that request, which is now happening around climate change and so on. Culture is still being determined by the North to a large extent. But we should really, I think, take note of what is happening in Southeast Asia. Obviously, China is a big player as well. We have to value our heritage and actually argue for our heritage and the understanding of how we can leverage that value, which is exactly what El-Shaar has said, in order to be able to, if you like, meet the obligations that are important for our people. As I said earlier, we do not have the ability to say this is going to just be a museum. We need to show how heritage is part and parcel of our reality. We still live within our own heritages. I have said this before, you know, the stories of our elders are still as important. They may just be intangible heritage, but they're critically important to the way in which we should see ourselves as Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Duko. I would like to continue this question by asking something. We have talked about the different international instruments and emphasized the incompatibility with our continent in so many ways. However, when we take an African instrument, for example, the Charter of African Cultural Renaissance, adopted in 2006, How can we explain that only a few countries have ratified this charter? Doesn't it show a weakness in our cultural advocacy? What are your insights on this?
Ben, moi, si vous me donnez la parole, je peux dire 2 mots sur cette question. Je peux?
Allez-y, oui, bien sûr.
Say, I think, I don't know if everyone can hear me. I think that the ratification of that charter, which I think was adopted in Khartoum in 2006, I think for me it is an issue of sincerity, just to be straight to the point. Africa cannot say that it is adopting a charter for the African cultural renaissance, and to say that because that is a constitutive aspect of African Union, and states don't ratify it. I think it is a serious question around our self-esteem. If we think that we are all together, if we think that really the project of African unity is a viable project, if we believe what our intellectuals have been telling us for a number of years, the cultural unity of the continent is something that goes back to prehistory up till now, we need to have our president say that they believe in African unity. If they believe that we need to kind of cancel the Berlin conference effect through cultural unity, we need to do that. So we need to kind of remove these political boundaries. If we don't do that, we're going to have Senegalese nationals, Ivorians, and this and that, which are going to bring about catastrophe in Africa. I think it is an issue of sincerity. It is a problem that should be raised to all the political leaders. We cannot bury our heads in the sand. Enough is enough. We need to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bokum. Is there any other inputs on this interesting question?
My input, Brian, to this, without to go beyond.
Brian, vous m'entendez?
Oui, Monsieur Bikoé, mais la parole était à Madame Drani. Elle va prendre la parole et je vous la redonnerai juste après.
S'il vous plaît.
Très bien, allez-y.
I will give you the speaker.
Sorry, what did you? Oh, okay.
I think it wasn't me who was answering the question because I've just come back on. I'd fallen off.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
It was Mrs. Ruzvidzo.
Yes, it is.
Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm looking at this question in light of all the other charters and the declarations that are signed at the African Union, including the AFCFTA. To get member states to sign on, it's critical that there is a lot of advocacy. And I think we have an opportunity in the cultural field because of this year's theme to mobilize and ensure that member states do sign in. Because remember, when these declarations and charters are signed at the African Union, it's the heads of states that are there. It doesn't necessarily mean that the minister specifically responsible for that area of focus is present. It therefore, I need to start my video. It therefore calls upon the different players and stakeholders in this area to mobilize and advocate to ensure that member states sign on. We've done a lot of work on the AFCFTA to ensure that we get the right numbers of heads of states signing on and countries signing on for the AFCFTA to be implemented. And I think we need to do the same in the cultural field, because then we undermine it. Whereas when it comes to trade, we've been out there and at the forefront. So my encouragement would be all the stakeholders in this field to mobilize and advocate for the countries to sign and declare their commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ruzvidzo. Professor Bikoé, you wanted to say something. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to continue in the same vein that my friend Bokum gave us, to say that in reality, this is an issue of sincerity. Personally, I was part of advocacy campaigns.
On ne vous entend plus, Monsieur Bikoy. Votre micro est...
Sorry, we have lost the speaker.
C'est relancé, parfait, monsieur. Vous pouvez
Can you hear me now? Yes, please go ahead. So I was saying that I personally participated in the advocacy for the ratification of this Charter for African Cultural Renaissance, and from capital to capital, I think with the AUC Commission team, we went through 5 capitals to advocate workshops and sensitization workshops, even at the governmental level. I don't know what else we would expect after the official signing to buy into such a charter. I even proposed to the AUC during a meeting that we would even need to revise the charter to drop the ratification clause, and we suggest that it should be operational as soon as the heads of state and government sign it, because ratification means that effectively we have long procedures which actually beat the very objective of the charter. So there is a problem of sincerity at the bottom of this, and also an issue of just copycat, legal copycat issues. We need to arm ourselves with procedures that don't end, and they're very expensive, because at the end of the day, this Charter of African Cultural Renaissance, it was signed between 2006 and only 15 member states have ratified it, and with a lot of challenges that we got 15. And massively, there was that clause that was introduced that once 15 member states have ratified it, we have to launch it, and that is what was done Monday and Tuesday last week. So there is that issue, and we need to rethink this problem. The people are actually cut off from the realities. What is true for the Charter is also true for the sincerity of other organizations and institutions that we set up. Once the signatures have been appended, the implementation is quite another ballgame altogether.
And exactly, you're completely right. The charter was launched and a few days ago. Thank you very much to all our panelists for your contribution and for this rich debate that has reminded us that the challenges we face today are also sources of change and opportunity for the continent. Of course, when it comes to Africa, there is never 2 hours is not enough to tackle all the challenges and all the aspects. We still could have talked about the diaspora, talk about more about languages in an educational system. But before handing over the floor to the chair of the session, Mr. El-Shaar, I would like to point out one fact. 2 days ago, we celebrated Africa Day, and His Excellency, Mr. Musa Faki Muhammad, the chair person of the African Union Commission, attested that Africa had long eclipsed the role of culture in the promotion and formation of nations, and confirmed his intention to correct this trend. He also calls on actors in all cultural spaces to contribute to the development of a sound and feasible consensus By doing so, he calls for unity among the actors of culture and reminded me of a quote from Kwame Nkrumah when he said, Kwame Nkrumah said, "It is clear that we must find an African solution to our problems, and that this can only be found in African unity. Divided, we are weak. United, Africa could become one of the greatest force for good in the world." It was my pleasure to moderate this session. Thank you all panelists, and over to you, Chair of the session, Mr. El-Shaar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. This has been indeed a very fruitful discussion. It looked at the opportunities and the challenges of mainstreaming and integrating culture and heritage into development plans and strategies at all levels. I believe the discussion has illuminated some creative ways for unleashing the full potentials of culture and heritage for improving human capital and promoting socio-economic progress and sustainable development. The discussion underscored the need for investing in youth, education, skills development, digital technologies, and innovation, and highlighted the importance of international development cooperation and multi-stakeholder partnerships. On behalf of all participants, I would like to thank you, Mr. Moderator, and to thank our distinguished speakers, and to thank all participants actually for contributing to this very successful dialogue. Before closing our meeting, I would like to remind all participants that the closing session of the Africa Dialogue series will be held momentarily at 12 p.m. So thank you so much for your participation. The meeting is closed. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good evening. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, welcome. Welcome to the closing session of the Africa Dialogue Series 2021. My name is Juliet Waswa Mugambwa. I'm a Senior Program Management Officer at the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. I have the honor to chair this closing session. As a reminder, interpretation is available through the Zoom platform in English, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. The closing session will include 3 distinguished speakers and a poet. We are going to hear from His Excellency, Mr. Ismail Shamfi, Permanent Representative of Comoros to the United Nations and Chair of the African Group for the month of May. Professor Ed Maloka, Chief Executive Officer of the African Peer Review Mechanism. Her Excellency, my dear sister, Ms. Fatima Chari Mohammed, Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations for closing remarks. And Ms. Aro Emene, who is a writer and a poet, originally from Northern Uganda. She's a recent recipient of James Olney Award for her poem, Home is a Woman.
She's not in the main camera. She's not on the main camera.
She is. She's there. Miss Aro Amene. As a reminder, speaker bios are available on the OSAA website at www.un.org/OSA/ADS 2021. Now, without delay, I have the great honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ismail Shamfi, Permanent Representative of Comoro to the United Nations and the Chair of the African Group for the month of May. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. It is my pleasure to participate in the closing session of the Africa Dialogue Series in my capacity as Chair of the month of the Group of African Ambassadors. Today, we finalize 3 days of enriching debate, but also 1 month of activities that have celebrated Africa's arts, culture, and heritage, which have triggered exciting conversations about the interrelation between culture, peace, and development. In this regard, allow me to start by thanking the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa and the African Union Permanent Observer Mission for having virtually brought Africa to New York for 1 month, for having transformed May into the month of Africa at the UN headquarters. Madam Under Secretary General, dear Sister Christina, you have set the bar quite high for next year. Rest assured that the African Group will continue to support your initiatives to bring Africa's reality to the policy debate in New York and to promote a new narrative from Africa and for Africa and from Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, during this month of Africa Dialogue Series, we have witnessed that a new narrative is indeed possible if only we give voice to African experts. We have had African filmmakers highlight the role that cinema can play in promoting an African identity and alert about the risks that global platforms pose to Africa's cultural diversity. We have learned about the power of museums in promoting unity and social cohesion by fighting misinformation and disinformation and by showing the common history that we Africans have and share. We have shown the world that Africa is a continent full of innovators who are ready to face emerging challenges from an African perspective while taking into account Africa's needs and realities. All in all, we have realized that culture and identity are powerful tools that can enable African countries to take ownership of their development. But for that purpose, as the theme of the Africa Dialogue Series suggests, we need to reshape mindsets. We need to change the perspective. Africa should not continue to be addressed as a continent in need of aid. Africa's past and present are full of success stories. We have seen many of them during this month of African history that the Africa Dialogue Series has brought to New York. Great civilizations were born in the continent without the help of external players. Ambitious projects are being promoted in our day and age, such as the African continent free trade area, meant to be the largest and most important market in the world. African countries are ready to lead a new approach to development, the only approach possible if the world is to succeed in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. In order to implement this new approach, African countries need partners who are committed, partners who respect Africa's role as a global player, partners who ensure that past inequalities are not used to maintain a global imbalance. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 2021 is a year of hope and opportunity for Africa and for the world. As it has been noted during these 3 days of discussions, the disruptions triggered by the COVID-19 provide an opportunity for all of us to build forward and to build better. The COVID-19 has laid down clearly what the priorities should be. It has shown the importance of human capital. Health and education cannot continue to be perceived as social rights only. They are fundamental components of development. Investing in health and education, investing in human capital is ensuring that our societies will be resilient and able to overcome future pandemics. COVID-19 has also proved how necessary it is to live in communion with nature. Economic growth needs to be approached from a perspective of environmental sustainability. Initiatives such as the Blue Economy promoted by African countries and the African Union, based on the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods and ecosystem health are the future. COVID-19 has also demonstrated that Africa's industrialization is a priority and a responsibility of African countries and their internal partners. As Undersecretary General Duarte noted at the beginning of this forum, every time that the world has undergone a crisis or a revolution, a new divide has appeared: the industrial divide, the digital divide, and now the COVID divide. But as I said before, let's make of the crisis an opportunity. Let's transform the risk of a vaccine divide into an opportunity to create a stronger Africa that fully contributes to global prosperity. Instead of trying to solve the shortage of vaccines worldwide in the traditional way, that is by discussing how much can developed countries increase their production and how many donations can be made, we need to seize the opportunity to increase Africa's capacity to produce its own vaccines and consequently strengthening the continent's resilience and its path toward development. We have the tools, the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa. We just need political will and the commitment of our partners to make this plan a reality. Furthermore, the start of trade under the AfCFTA provides a perfect opportunity to transform the pharmaceutical industry into a trigger of growth and development in the continent. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude by thanking again Under-Secretary General Duarte, Ambassador Mohammed, and all panelists and participants for their contributions to this edition of the African Dialogue Series. I look forward to our continued collaboration, and I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Comoros to the United Nations for his remarks. And now, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Ed Maloka, Chief Executive Officer, African Peer Review Mechanism. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, my sister.
Your Excellencies, please allow me to stand on existing protocol and also the presence of my fellow panelists and of course all the participants here, our academics, civil society, cultural workers, the private sector, the colleagues from all corners of our continent and in the diaspora who really animated the 3 days that have kept us together. Good morning or good evening to you all, depending on the part of the world where you are. I would like at the outset, like the previous speaker, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Comoros just did, to extend my sincere and deep appreciation to the Special Advisor on Africa, our dear sister and Undersecretary General Christine Duarte, and her able team for organizing the 2021 Africa Dialogue Series, and indeed for inviting us to address this August gathering as we close this captivating public forum. And I must also recognize my dear sister and colleague, Excellency Fatima Kareja Mohamed, who's our permanent representative of the African Union at the United Nations. Thank you very much. The discussions held over the last 3 days, Excellencies, were rich, illuminating, and thought-provoking, and indeed a call to action for our continent and for all of us. The various perspectives offered by the stakeholders who participated at this event can shape policies and our views on culture, heritage, and the arts at the national, continental, and international levels for many years to come. Certainly, culture evokes ancestral traditions, a connection with our proud past, and our powerful sense of identity today. But it also provides us with avenues to chart our future, one that is prosperous and peaceful. The panelists and moderators who spoke before me all underlined this point, but it bears repeating. And I know that this is the point that our host, our dear sister, Christine Duarte, feels very strong about, that culture can and must play a role in helping Africa rewrite its narrative and meet its developmental aspirations, particularly those contained in Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. Several cogent points were made, Excellencies, in this forum. In the interest of time, I just wish to highlight just a few from some of the panelists. I was particularly interested on the session that touched on the sustainable peace development, in particular a presentation by one of the panelists on museums, affirming that museums are a vehicle for the promotion of peace, education, and sustainable development, that they transmit ideas even in the absence of teachers. In Africa, these panelists observe museums now try to have a cultural impact in order to foster lifelong learning and preserve heritage. Our colleague challenged the idea that students visit museums only to know about history. Rather, they seek to understand community issues when they go to museums. These are places that enlighten students on contemporary societal issues such as gender, social inclusion, and of course, the big issue of racism. Furthermore, young people should not be presented with answers to the questions they pose, but encouraged to create them. Finally, Excellencies, museums contribute to knowledge creation as impartial repositories of knowledge which offer all sides to a story. The other participants, Excellencies, acknowledge that stability and peace are essential for progressive development in economic, social, and political matters. They call for the protection of cultural and natural heritage to achieve economic productivity. And one of the colleagues indeed emphasized that according to that person, this progress cannot be achieved by discounting history. By offering us an understanding of our past, history allows for the creation of institutions of conflation which raise consciousness and advance progress for peaceful coexistence of our people. These colleagues refer to history as what he called the mind of the globe, which will drive the mind of the world. History is conducive for growth since it captures the past and prepares us for the future. Also, history will not only eliminate ignorance, but hatred too, which is the source of conflict and many of the issues of the diversity management we are confronted with today. Other panelists, and in particular here, our colleague, the permanent representative of Algeria, spoke on financing for development and illicit financial flows. In the context characterized by COVID-19 pandemic, which has battered African countries, our colleague called for the international community to increase the allocation of financial resources for development purposes so as to achieve widely identified as 4 objectives. One is dealing with the initial illicit financial flows themselves. Secondly, addressing mounting debt vulnerability. Thirdly, developing domestic resource of financing. And then fourthly, ensuring stable and predictable ODA. Excellencies, during the roundtable on harnessing culture and heritage for economic transformation, one of our colleagues recalled that terms such as world heritage, community managed research, heritage, and traditional knowledge systems, in spite of initial oppositions to them, have now been mainstream and accepted as day-to-day jargon. This colleague argued that these concepts were frowned upon because they originated in the periphery rather than the center. Colonization, a phenomenon of land appropriation as well as destruction of the mind, body, and spirit, cannot explain the underdevelopment of Africa on its own, because other regions such as the Asian tigers, like South Korea and Malaysia, which were also under foreign subjugation like ourselves, as the indigent and many African countries we were over the last decades or so, have now grown wealthy. So the question is, we have to look at ourselves as the African continent and say, we were all colonized, but what is it that other regions got right that we ourselves call it? These colleagues suggested changing our mindset by appreciating and enriching African cultural treasures. Bringing about change will require, among others, understanding that youth and women have a major role to play in Africa's development and promoting Africa's standing internationally without fear, apologies, or ambiguities. Excellencies, our colleague from Kenya, the permanent representative of Kenya, expounded on Africa's industrialization opportunities, particularly manufacturing, which is the traditional avenue to enter the middle class, is woefully low in Africa, which is the youngest and fast urbanizing continent. The low pace of job creation and inadequate delivery of public goods, coupled with increased access to information, produce big expectation in the minds of many of our people. Development in its industrial form and its attendant consequences, investment, productivity, and employment, can better Africa's lot. Africa's industrialization is an opportunity for the multilateral system, the private sector, and states, has the potential to drive growth globally. Investments in industrialization on the African continent can reduce, of course, and can contribute initially to, significantly to complete prevention, even act as an early warning factor. Attention should be paid, of course, as some colleagues said in the state at this point, repeatedly in the previous session, attention should also be paid to the African continental free trade area, which can foster diversification, competitiveness, and raise awareness of Africa's stature as a potential and also a desirable destination for global capital flows. Excellencies, this is just my summary of some of the key takeaways which I identified. Through this forum, I can confidently say that culture has been liberated and explored in ways which we seldom do. Now we need to translate rhetoric into action and invest more in culture and heritage as recommended by one of the participants, the regional director for UNDP Bureau for Africa. Indeed, these aspects of civilization can catalyze Africa's development and reduce inequality between the haves and the have-nots. This year's edition of Africa Dialogue Series has indeed interrogated limitations, outlined possibilities, and changed the mindsets. I once again would like to thank our sister, the Under Secretary Christine Duarte, and her office for crafting this month's program and bringing us together, all of us, to discuss the meaning, impact, and potential of the creative industry. As the APRM, Your Excellencies, we stand ready to partner and support the office on the next step. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
I thank the Chief Executive Officer of the African Peer Review Mechanism for his enlightened remarks, a comprehensive way of the takeaways from the Africa Dialogue Series. Indeed, reshaping the mindset is it will be a comprehensive process for all of us. Now, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Fatima Chari Mohammed, Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations, for closing remarks. My sister, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, dear Juliet. Your Excellency, Ambassador Ismail Shanfi, Chair of the African Group for the month of May. my dear brother, Professor Eddie Maloka, and my dear sister, USG Christina Duarte, Excellencies, distinguished lay guests, and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from New York, and warm greetings to all that are joining us today from around the world. Let me start by sincerely thanking you for joining us today and for your active participation throughout the month of May for the 2021 Africa Dialogue Series under the theme Cultural Identity and Ownership, Reshaping Mindsets. After that brilliant summary by my brother, Dr. Maloka, permit me really to say congratulations. Congratulations to all who made this event a success. You all deserve a round of applause. The African Dialogue Series over the month of May has showcased Africa's rich culture, which culminated with a 3-day public policy debate. And this initiative presented and highlighted, amongst others, how our rich African culture can be a driving force for peace, for growth and integration, and particularly when special attention is paid to our shared values of family, respect for elders, community solidarity, hard work, as well as hospitality, generosity, and charity and social cohesion, and how this relates to education, folklore, language, film, music, theater, literature, etc. Our rich history from one generation to the next, Africans have developed a massive intellectual arsenal of cultural norms, and all this has been guided by a profound wisdom of cultural values that help individuals and societies to overcome challenges and thrive together. At a time of a global crisis, where the world is threatened by the combined trials of health, socioeconomic, environmental, and other challenges, we have faced new realities which have exposed our vulnerabilities and the fragility of existing models and practices to deliver even on the most basic of human needs. With the unprecedented complexity of today's COVID-19 recovery and sustainable development challenges, it is clear we must be wiser in our approaches and re-examine possibilities for authentic and sustainable solutions by leveraging on our rich cultural norms. The concept of leaving behind, for example, particularly those who are most in need, is genuinely integrated into the African social fabric and is constantly applied through people's daily practices. Understanding how culture and traditions have helped people in Africa to survive and adapt for generations before the emergence of some of these synthetic models could be key to developing sustainable policies to mitigate future challenges and fast track our pace towards the realization of the Africa we want. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today more than ever, it is vital to ensure the protection and promotion of cultural heritage and indigenous knowledge, where new challenges are emerging due to the combined effect of growing inequalities, escalation of conflicts, and the surge of poverty. In our increasingly interconnected world, the potential of the cultural component should remain one of the essential sources of intellectual knowledge that needs to be harnessed and tailored towards the development of Africa. Over the past 2 days in particular, within the context of the Public Policy Forum, our policy debates and discussions focused on how to unlock the transformative potential of culture and for the implementation of sustainable development goals and build back better, particularly after the pandemic. The panels and speakers presented profound reflections and insights on how to address many of the challenges and introduced in-depth analysis and policy recommendations. We are really grateful for their lively, interactive discussions, particularly in engaging with the audience. Moving forward, and as we're exploring our path to recover from the devastating impact of the pandemic and build back better for the implementation of Agenda 2063 and the SDGs, we're grateful for all your contributions and particularly to all the speakers, the panelists, and the audience. And we, I think, have come out richer in addressing some of the new realities, but particularly leveraging off of our rich cultural heritage. I wish to thank you all. And particularly, I would also like to recognize the academia, the researchers, the artists who have also enriched our initiative this month and provided us with enormous, unlimited content throughout the month. And I thank you once again for your kind presence and invaluable contribution. I would also like to thank the leadership and working teams of our partners in organizing this event. And particularly, I'd like to recognize the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa and the incredible team, USG. It's amazing what your team has been able to do. UNESCO and of course, Africa Renewal, and of course, my colleagues at the AU and the AU Observer Mission in particular for their tireless contribution in making this a success. To conclude, permit me to end by quoting one of our African leaders, former President Thabo Mbeki, and in his words, and I am saying this as a very proud African, and I quote, "I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land." I thank you all for joining us in this event. Merci, shukran, obrigado, gracias, asante sana.
I thank the permanent observer of the African Union to the United Nations for her closing remarks. I would like to thank the three distinguished speakers for their inspiring remarks. Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before concluding Africa Dialogue Series 2021, we will hear a poem from Ms. Arui Amene, writer and poet. She's going to recite her award-winning poem, Home is a Woman. Ms. Amene, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. My name is, the correct pronunciation of my name is Arau Ameny. My poem was published in the Southern Review in 2020 and won the James Only Award. I'm thankful and grateful to be here today to share my words and my art with all of you around the world. I wanted to say thank you to the poetry editor, Jessica Faust, at the Southern Review for believing in me and in my work, Again, this poem is called Home is a Woman, and my name is Arau Ameny. Home is a woman. Before I enter the matatu for the drive to Kampala, then Lira, the driver stops me to tell me he's never seen me on this route. You must live outside. I remember I live outside of my own country. I pretend not to hear. And he says it again, this time behind a cigarette and a smile. He asks me, who are your people? Who is your father, your grandfather? Saying he may know my people. I tell him my mother's name and her mother's name and my great-grandmother's names. I tell him about the names of the land they could not inherit unless their brothers or fathers or husbands gave it to them. I name and map the land from the tree to the edge of the river. I tell him where my great-grandmothers were born, where my grandmothers were born, where my mother was born. I hum the names of the women in my family over and over like a forgotten prayer, a forbidden song. He asks again, "Who are your forefathers, you girl?" I ask him, "And who gave birth to them?" And I say the names of the women who gave birth to them. Our ride is silent from Kampala to Lira. He gives me a curious glance from the rearview mirror at my many faces, looking at me while I hold on to my suitcase, while I carry all the women living inside of me. I carry them home. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for listening to my words. Thank you for allowing me to appreciate, to share my art. Again, my name is Arau Ameny. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Arau Ameny.
Thank you.
For her beautiful poem. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, you are all invited to watch one final concert featuring music from the African continent, being streamed this afternoon on the Office of the Special Advisor website. Thank you very much for participating in the Africa Dialogue Series 2021. We look forward to your engagement, commitment, and participation in Africa Dialogue Series 2022. Merci, Sukran, Abrigada, Asante Sana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, madam. Thank you very much. My regards.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My regards.
Thank you to all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
To all the participants. Bye. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.